Hi everyone. In this particular review video, we're obviously going to be looking at succession. Succession is the idea that an environment is going to be constantly changing. It's never going to stay stagnant or the same. And so in these two pictures, you can see we have two examples of succession. In this picture over here, we see that we start with bare rock and we begin to allow small producers to come in that break down the rock, form a little bit of soil. We get a little bit of a larger producer and a larger producer. This is known as primary succession because you're starting from the very beginning. You're starting with bare rock and you need to have that soil formed and established in this region. So this process of forming soil and establishing soil takes a very long time. So primary succession tends to be a little bit longer than secondary succession, but as you can see, there's this building aspect of where you're starting very small, you're building, you're adding in diversity. So there's a lot of different plants beginning to come in towards the later stages, and you're going to then add in different consumers that come into the region. Secondary succession is very similar to primary succession, except you're not starting from scratch. You've already broken down that rock. You've already established soil in this particular region. So there's already been an environment here. In secondary succession, you're saying that there's been some kind of disturbance that has set the environment back a few steps or kind of has restarted it from that soil stage. So here you can see that there is once again a building aspect. So you're starting with small producers and you're getting a little larger, and a little larger until you get to the peak environment that can exist in this particular environment. This peak environment is known as a climax community. But in both of these, you can see there are sequential steps and there's an organized way that that environment is going to move from that beginning stage to that ending stage. So if I look at this image, you can see we start with bare rock. We have some pioneer species that are coming in and breaking down that rock that can live on the rock. There's not a lot of things that can live on bare rock and get their basic needs met. But things like lichen and moss can do that. And as they die and break down that rock, that's going to create a layer of topsoil where grasses and small weeds can grow. And once the soil is established and once there's a lot of nutrients in that soil, then you're going to get more diversity in your producers. So this picture is showing you shrub growth, some bushes, maybe even some small tree seedlings that are going to be coming in. And then finally, you're going to increase into where you can get to an area where you have a climax community, that peak community. And I like this image because it really shows you that there's predictable steps. If a scientist comes in right here in this particular area where there's grasses, they can predict what the next stage in that environment is going to be. Now, will they be around to see it? Not necessarily. This process takes a very long time. This isn't like day one, day two. This process can take hundreds of thousands of years. So what they do is they predict and say, you know what, after this stage, this is what I predict to see coming into the region. But we also know that disturbances can come in and set this environment back at any time to create an even longer timeline in order to get it to that climax community. So some of the natural disturbances that can come into an environment and really set that environment back are things like fire, wind, blizzards, and drought. So those are natural disasters, natural disturbances that can have that timeline of getting from the beginning to that climax community kind of slowed, and it can reset it back. So if you remember in the game that we played in class, oftentimes you would take 3 steps forward and maybe a step back because something would happen in your environment and take you back a few steps. So it's not a go from A to B in a very quick manner. It is a very slow process with disturbances along the way. Now, some of the disturbances like wind can have varying amounts of impact in an ecosystem. So if you have a windstorm that blows down one tree, well, right there where that tree blows down, that area has been reset or taken back a few steps and it's going to have to rebuild itself. But that is a much smaller impact than if I were to have a tornado come through with wind that wipes out acres upon acres upon acres of producers, trees and shrubs and things like that. So sometimes we have very small disturbances and sometimes we have very large disturbances that can come in and have that succession take place. Humans can also disturb an environment. So when we develop land or when we pollute the air, we know that that's going to have an effect on the plant life within that region. And plants are the foundation of every energy pyramid. They are what is establishing the amount of energy in the region. So if you have air pollution creating acid rain, that's going to affect your environment because the animals are not going to be able to survive well if the plants are not in healthy conditions or if some of the plants are being killed because the rain that is falling on them is too acidic. Other things that can happen are things like invasive species. So when one species is taken from one environment and brought into a new environment because humans think that it's a really cool organism, so they grab it, they bring it back to their homeland. What happens is if that particular species doesn't have any predators to keep its population in check or from outgrowing or growing too large, then this species can actually wreak havoc on an environment and really cause that environment to get set back a couple of steps. So these are all things that humans can do to the environment that aren't necessarily natural. So here's an image that shows a good progression of succession. So this may take place over the course of several years. You can see where there's been a fire or some kind of drought that has come through, and we have a lot of death down here on the floor of the forest. Over here, you can see where some of that death has been decomposed, but you're beginning to see a small amount of producer come in. And then over here, you're seeing more producers coming back into the region. You're seeing that regrowth. And so these are three very simple steps that may take place over 5 years, but you can see there's a sequential order of a disturbance coming in, a little bit of rebuilding, and a little bit more rebuilding. And as you go from step to step, you're seeing more diversity in the plant life, which is going to bring in more diversity in the organisms, the consumers that can live in that environment. So if I look at this image, just as a reminder, you can see it's got a timeline, but at any point, a disturbance can come in and reset this ecosystem back. So where it takes a little bit longer. But community A, where the pioneer species are at, they are preparing the environment for B. B prepares the environment for C. C prepares the environment for the organisms that are coming in D. And D prepares the environment for the organisms that are going to be in that climax community. Realize that just because you have a pioneer species in A doesn't mean that that species is going to be able to live in the environment all the way through. As these trees grow nice and tall, they're going to be sending out their branches, which block sunlight. And any of that low-lying growth, the small bushes, the grass that have their sunlight blocked are not going to be able to thrive in the environment. So some of the species that we see in an environment will kind of either migrate or die out of the region because as new species and new diversity comes into the region, they get choked out of that region or they're no longer able to get their basic needs met. So we do see that change in community, but we also see that change in the organisms and the consumers that can live in each of those stages. But the earlier stages will prepare the environment for the later stages. So here's an example of succession. So we have several stages and they're out of order. So if I were to organize this and put it in predictable steps like a scientist would, we would say, okay, here at stage Z, we have a disturbance. So Z is probably when the disturbance occurs in that environment. So we're looking at secondary succession. If I look at what probably comes next after Z, I'm going to think, okay, decomposers are going to come in and break down all of this timber that's on the ground. And so I'm going to get a small amount of plant growth that is able to establish itself. And so that leads me to picture X. And so if I click out of this real fast, I'm going to actually organize these. So Z goes here. That's first. That's after the disturbance. X would be next because we can see a little bit of plant growth. Here, I'm going to say, all right, between W and Y, what would be the next predictable step? Most likely, stage Y would be the most predictable because it's building. We have some trees in that region now, but it's not quite to that climax community. And when I finish up and I put them in order, I should see predictable steps of rebuilding in that environment. So if I look, I have the death. I have the little bit of plant growth regrowing. I'm beginning to see a little bit of that, the trees and things like that growing. And then I'm going to my full-blown climax community. This doesn't just happen in a forest, though. We can see how a lake would transform into a pond and a marshy area and then a forest. This is considered succession. And we can also see how in a desert environment, we would have that particular environment change from bacteria to desert grass to desert shrubs to the cactus. So you can see how that environment would change to that.